Rain pushes into far northern parts of Scotland. Many central parts will get increasingly cloudy. Further south, it should be dry and bright with some sunshine.
And there may be some hazy sunshine across Northern Ireland, but at the moment it's looking mostly fine and sunny here as we head through the morning and into the afternoon.
So the rain and hill snow in the north will continue its way southwards this afternoon with a few showers elsewhere. And that's how it's looking for you today.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Hello and welcome. I'm Alastair Stewart, and for the next 2 hours I'll be keeping you company here on TV and radio with the stories that really matter across the country and indeed across the world. We've plenty coming up. We'll be discussing the overnight developments in Ukraine, as I, like many, still very much care about it. But we'll also be discussing issues closer to home. The cost of living crisis, net zero, the hike in energy prices and the price of everyday essentials like milk and bread. Are they squeezing Ukraine to the back of people's minds and off the front pages? And if that's the case, what's the impact upon the policymakers, the political leaders, the military leaders, and the rest of them? Delighted to be joined by an absolute top panel, a wealth of guests to unpack all of that. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the GB News. Here's Olivia Guthrie.
Thank you, Alistair. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 12. Here's the latest from the GB Newsroom. The Foreign Secretary says Russia's indiscriminate attacks on civilians in Ukraine must be investigated as war crimes. Liz Truss says there's increasing evidence of what she's calling appalling acts by retreating Russian forces in towns like Irpin and Bucha. Ms Truss insists the UK will not rest until those responsible for atrocities face justice in the International Criminal Court. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's strengthening their defences in the east of the country after continued Russian missile attacks overnight. Plumes of smoke were seen over the southern city of Odessa after Russia's defence ministry claims strikes have destroyed an oil refinery and 3 fuel storages there. Ukrainian officials say several rockets have also hit the seaport of Mykolaiv this morning. The Kremlin's chief negotiator says peace talks with Ukraine aren't ready for top-level involvement yet as they resume tomorrow. President Zelensky says Moscow wants to take control of the east of Ukraine.
We're strengthening our defences in the east of the Donbass. We're aware the enemy has resources to put pressure on the eastern part of the country. What is the aim of the Russian armed forces? They want to seize both the Donbass and the south of our country. What's our aim? To defend our freedom, our land, our people. To do everything to repel them.
Well, meanwhile, Boris Johnson's held discussions with President Zelensky overnight, congratulating Ukraine's military pushback at Russia's advance. Downing Street says the Prime Minister also repeated his assurances the UK will step up its support. President Zelensky says he would welcome Britain's help in diplomatic efforts to end the war. Well, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister says work is ongoing to try to get civilians out of Mariupol. Irina Vereshchuk says with the assistance of the Red Cross, buses are attempting to get as close as possible to the besieged city. But the situation on the ground is volatile. Tens of thousands of residents are trapped there with food and water in short supply. The Business Secretary says there could be a significant expansion in the UK's nuclear power capacity. In an interview with the Sunday Telegraph, Kwasi Kwarteng suggested there could be 6 or 7 new large-scale nuclear power stations in operation by 2050, producing as much as a quarter of our energy needs. It's part of efforts to wean the UK off Russian oil in the wake of the war in Ukraine. The Chancellor's being urged to set out an emergency budget to help people across the UK who are struggling with the rising cost of living. The SNP's Alison Thewlis is calling on Rishi Sunak to provide a generous grant for those she says will be plunged into poverty and hardship. She's demanding action from the government as bills and national insurance payments increase. Economist Vicky Price has told GBNews Mr Sunak can't ignore the hardship people are going to face.
People are going to be very dissatisfied in the year ahead, and it will mean for the Chancellor that if people do not go out and spend as much as they otherwise would, you have to rethink his growth forecast, for example, already reduced very substantially from 6% to 3.8% for this year. Will they have to be reduced even further? And if that is the case, then he's going to be collecting a lot less in tax as well. So he's got an incentive to ensure that people feel confident and they go out and spend, but we're actually seeing already consumer confidence decline.
A Conservative MP has been suspended from the parliamentary party pending an investigation into allegations over his conduct. The claims about David Warburton are being examined by the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme. The Sunday Telegraph reports the parliamentary watchdog has received a report alleging he behaved inappropriately. The married father of 2 told the newspaper he has enormous amounts of defence and denies any wrongdoing. Pakistan's president has dissolved parliament and called early elections following an opposition attempt to remove Prime Minister Imran Khan from office. It comes after a no-confidence vote in Mr Khan was blocked by Parliament's Deputy Speaker. The former cricketer, who was elected in 2018, believes the move to oust him was orchestrated by the US, a claim Washington denies. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Alistair.
Olivia, thank you very much. Coming up this afternoon on Alastair Stewart and Friends, however ghastly it is, are you growing frustrated with the crisis in Ukraine? Well, I'll be discussing the overnight developments in Ukraine, but I'll also be discussing the degree to which diplomacy and politics are affected by public concern or the growing lack of it. I'm joined by a wealth of guests to help us unpack all of that. Plus, this hour, as the cost of living crisis rumbles on, I'll be discussing the degree to which net zero is going to be a victim of the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis. Sticking with that, for our Rural Spotlight segment today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Personal Finance Manager, a good friend of ours, that's Justine Bartels, regarding the rising prices of essential food items like milk and bread and what we can do to help ourselves. I think you might be intrigued. Plus, my good equestrian friends have returned home after their mission of delivering goods to the Polish-Ukrainian border, and they have some terrific stories to tell. We'll be catching up with one of them this hour as they're now planning their next trip. And as always, I genuinely want to hear from you on those subjects or anything that you think we haven't dealt with that we should be dealing with. Email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk. We're also on Twitter and Facebook. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can catch up on previous interviews and programmes and what's going on right now. I'm going to start with a sort of slightly odd confession. I had a dreadful thought when I came off air after yesterday's programme. Are we entering the fatigue phase over Ukraine? Fresh images of the horrors remind us that this is still a bloody war, mutilated children, booby-trapped corpses. But the Red Cross wrestle with seemingly insurmountable problems just to get people out of Mariupol, as you just heard in Olivia's news bulletin. My guests, academics, politicians, saw problem upon problem with the prospect of achieving a negotiated peace in my conversations yesterday. They all agreed that the UK had done well, but had to do even better in support and on military equipment for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have done much better on the battlefield than most expected, and the Russians far worse than anyone predicted. But how a war would end in victory wasn't clear, and it would be bloody either way. We also spoke to good people who just wanted to help, support for the growing army of refugees, the simple offer of support on the ground for those who've lost pretty well everything. So today I am going to take a deep breath. How on earth can this end, and when? I've invited an old friend of mine, a former correspondent at the United Nations. Where are the UN in this crisis? Has their time come and gone? Is it, as the former Intelligence and Security Minister Dame Pauline Neville-Jones recently said on this programme, a League of Nations moment, where after the First World War it was agreed the existing international structures were simply past their sell-by date, and so the UN emerged? Has the UN hit a similar wall? I've also invited back a former RUSI staffer who is now with the American Enterprise Institute to join me. She focuses on deterrence against emerging forms of aggression. And I've asked Cong Hochlan, who is the defence editor and chief columnist at The Telegraph, to join me, partly to talk about the anniversary of the Falklands conflict, but also to reflect on the apparently intransigent nature of the Ukraine war. And General Sir Richard Barrons, who's a former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, will be joining us in our 1 o'clock segment. Finally, we'll be joined by Lesia Vasilenko, MP, People's Deputy of Ukraine. We're also today talking about net zero and new evidence that you, the people, are fast falling out of love with it, and the cost that it demands of all of us. The Business and Energy Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, gives a big interview in The Telegraph today, well worth reading. And the newspaper, as a result of that, leads on his and the government's aim to commission 7 new nuclear power stations. Talk, too, of a big wind farm in the Irish Sea. So I guess as we gird our loins for those higher energy bills at home and all of the other hits this month in the cost of living crisis, folk may be slightly more focused on that than the horrors facing the poor souls in Ukraine. I'd love to hear what you think, particularly if you think I'm completely wrong about that and anything else that's on your mind. As always, email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can tweet, you can post on Facebook, and a good number of you have already been doing that. Or you can use any of our other social media outlets. And I'm delighted to say that sitting here in the studio with me, my first guests are Mark Seddon. Mark's the former UN correspondent for Al Jazeera English television, and before that he was editor of Tribune newspaper. And sitting next to him, a return appearance, I'm delighted to say, by Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow, Foreign and Defence Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, and as I said, formerly with RUSI, the UK think tank on defence and diplomatic matters. Thanks very much indeed. I said to you while we were sitting having a coffee outside before coming in, am I completely wrong to be talking about fatigue at this stage?
You're not. I think if the Chris Rock, Will Smith incident had happened the day after the invasion, nobody would have paid any attention to it. Now it's getting enormous attention simply because people are looking for for a change in the news. And it's terrible that the Ukrainians are essentially the victims of this, but it's also human nature. We focus on something for a while, then we move on. And had Russia won a swift victory, that would have not been surprising that we would have moved on. Now the Ukrainians are fighting back. They need all the support they can get, and yet we are many people are beginning to focus on other things that concern them, big and small.
Yeah. And does that directly impact? We saw in Olivia's news bulletin there, the Prime Minister talking to Zelensky pretty well every day and saying, well done, we'll give you everything that you need and so on. If political sympathy, empathy declines, and it's barely on the front pages today, does that impact upon the political and the diplomatic process to bring a peace?
I mean, don't forget, this war has actually been running for 8 years, 14,000 people already killed. This has been a war.
You're taking us back to Ukraine,
and so there
Crimea.
has been, yes,
yeah.
and Crimea, and there has been a fatigue for quite some time, if you like, suddenly brought home to people by the invasion. I wonder, because we don't really know what's going to happen next, what horror could happen next. This is the first war that any of us can recall where people are talking about the possible use of nuclear weapons. The Russians have. You have to go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis for that to have happened before. And then you have to look at all the other issues too. I mean, so much of what people are concerned about, energy prices, food prices, go back to this conflict in Ukraine. And so much of the political fortune of leaders, not least Putin, who seems to be in rather a weak position from where we're sitting, but also Biden. The German Chancellor, Macron, is on a knife edge, we read in the papers today. So all of this is feeding into them. They all need a solution, and pretty quick, I would say.
Yeah. Where is the UN in all of this? As I said, you used to cover United Nations matters for Al Jazz.
Yeah, that's a good... Well, I mean, I went on to work for the UN. I worked for the Secretary-General and Ban Ki-moon. And I make the contrast between Ban Ki-moon and, of course, his predecessor, Kofi Annan, and Antonio Guterres, because, before the invasion happened, when it was clear that there was something very strong was likely to happen, President Macron was making the running. Other leaders, Guterres was working, he says, in the background. Since then, he's seen this very much as a humanitarian crisis, which, of course, it is, but it's also a political one. And a lot of people have been saying, well, you're in your second term, Secretary-General. You've got the Security Council. Absolutely. Russia on the Security Council bulldozed through the UN Charter. Take some risks. Get out there. Why isn't Guterres bringing Zelensky and Putin together?
And the UN was set up to solve exactly these differences between countries. We have to remember that is the main function of the of the United Nations, rather, to make sure that countries don't go to war against each other, and if they do, to stand up for the aggrieved party. But where has the UN been? It is really a tragedy to see, which is why the action is, as you say, being taken by Macron, being taken by Joe Biden, being taken by Boris Johnson even. But the world after World War II thought that we needed a body that could settle differences, and this was going to be it, and it's not it.
No. I mean, interesting talking about individuals, people like Secretary-Generals of the United Nations. Jens Stoltenberg at NATO has played a blinder. I've said that several times on this programme. He knows what the rules of engagement are. He knows what Clause 5 allows and doesn't allow. He's got more military spending out of Germany than has ever been the case before, and he's held the line. So the UN are not doing as well as NATO are.
No, and NATO is doing what it's supposed to do. Yes, you could say they should go beyond their responsibilities, but nevertheless, they are doing what they're supposed to do, which is protect the territory of their member states. And sad as it is, they don't have any obligations to Ukraine, but they have kept together, they've kept a common position on Russia, Ukraine. They are individually helping Ukraine in sending weapons to the Ukrainians. So, yes, as you say, NATO has done better. NATO, which is supposed to be an obsolete organization.
But, it's interesting because the UN is also the sum of its member states. If you've got a Security Council member in Russia, which is breaking the charter, and you've got stasis there, it then moves to the General Assembly. We've had 2 emergency resolutions, unusually condemning Russia in the same way often America is singled out over Israel-Palestine in terms of the number of supporters they get. But, you know, in all of this, what hasn't happened, because the UN is there for a different purpose, for peace and security. NATO is protecting its member states. The interesting thing about what hasn't yet happened at the UN, but which could, is there is a device called a Uniting for Peace resolution, which could go through the General Assembly, which would then mandate the Secretary-General to use all means to bring about peace and security, including military force.
Indeed, but so long as both Russia and China sit on the Security Council as opposed to the General Assembly, there can be no really significant, lasting, durable movement through the permanent five. That's going to be vetoed.
Not through the Security Council, because that's over, really.
Yeah.
The General Assembly is interesting because the last time this... I mean, I personally don't... I'd be surprised if it happened, but it has happened before during the Korean War, when obviously the vetoes were being used at the Security Council, but the UN intervened because the General Assembly voted for this Uniting for Peace resolution. It's got this mechanism it can use if it wants to. But in order for all of this to happen, and in order for many of those countries in the global south that have either been reluctant or sat on the fence or... You know, there's got to be a degree of consistency, and this is what's got to come out of this. To get a solution in Ukraine, you need consistency. Wherever countries are occupied or invaded, whether it's Western Sahara or the Golan Heights, I mean, Israel's been there for 50-odd years, there needs to be this consistency, which is lacking.
One of your areas of expertise, and I mentioned it in the introduction, is deterrence, i.e. stopping this kind of nonsense and horror occurring. That is at stake as well in how Ukraine is resolved. As Mark just said, you can't just barge into another country, even if you say historically, philosophically, it's ours, it's always been ours, and there's a lot of really brilliant stuff that's been written about that, the antecedents of it, both in the atlases and in the history books. But the result of this has a vital precedent status for international relations.
It does, and if we look at the history of countries invading other countries, the lesson learned is that the to-be-invaded country has to signal strongly enough that there will be a price to pay if you invade, and not just the to-be-invaded country, its friends as well. Sure. And I think that's where we failed. We as the West didn't signal strongly enough to Russia, starting in 2014, that there would be a price to pay if Russia took further steps. 2014 was bad enough, but we should have signaled that there would be a major price to pay if Russia...
Well, as Mark said, we blinked over Crimea.
We did, yes. And it's too late to respond when the action is already taking place. It's better than nothing if you respond when the action is taking place, but you should respond, or you should signal long before that you will not like the consequences if you do what you're planning to do. So you better not do it.
I said when I mentioned that Con McLaughlin was joining us later on, talk partly about the Falklands, a lot of really very powerful stuff, not only personal remembrances of people who were in the Falklands, but somebody, and I can't remember which article it was, reminded me that the then leader of the Labour Party, Michael Foot, famously, I mean, also a former Tribune man like you, said that the Falklands Task Force was right because it was about British responsibilities, it was about sovereignty, and it was about self-determination. You've got in the papers today Labour's shadow peace and disarmament minister saying, I don't mind if the Russians spike our nukes.
Well, I haven't seen that. I mean, I'd be fascinated to know what that story is about. But I have to...
It's Fabian Hamilton.
Oh, right. Right, OK. Well, he's a Leeds MP, isn't he?
I think so.
I mean, I don't know. But the thing is, I remember the Falklands War. I mean, for what it was worth, I was opposed to it. But Michael Foot got a lot of stick at the time. But actually, he was being completely consistent as far as he was concerned. Argentina was run by a fascist dictator, and you don't go and... If you don't happen to like the British being in the Falkland Islands, there are all sorts of negotiations you can have and all the rest of it. But, you know, I think it's also a time to think about... You know, it's also the 30th anniversary of the invasion of Bosnia by Serbia, when really the West didn't do very much. We've got a ceasefire in Yemen, 8 years of war or so, 340,000 people killed. I mean, this is going on and on and on, and the international mechanisms aren't working. And they need reform, clearly. If they've got
Do you both fear that this can only be resolved, and that's why my point about losing public support and sympathy, empathy for it, in a traditional battle, a traditional war, where Zelensky says he's doing well and Johnson congratulates him on his progress and what have you. It's going to be a fight to the finish.
But it has to end, though. But it has to end. It will end.
But on the
some
battlefield.
Point. But how what we can see, it seems to me, I'm not a military. My dad was in the army, and if he was here, he would say, well, what was the aim? We were talking about this earlier. What's the aim of the Russians? What were they going to do? They were going to topple the government. They were going to occupy which bits? It's all fallen apart, it would seem. So they're going back to square one with the. If it doesn't, and it continues to get ramped up, there'll be more and more civilians fighting. And I understand some British diplomats are saying, well, of course, it suits us for this to continue. We're sending a message to Putin. This shows how weak he is, so he won't do it again. But the people, it's quite a cynical view, that, because the people who are going to suffer are going to be civilians. The Russians have shown us what they're capable of doing to cities, is destroying them. And how long is that going to continue? It may not be a perfect peace, but Putin's not going to be around forever, is he?
Can you both come back at 1 o'clock? No, go very quick one.
As bad or as impotent as the West is, it's better to have the West in a leading position than to have a country like China, which is refusing to do anything because it wouldn't benefit from it. It's not seeing good and evil, it's just seeing what happens to be advantageous to China at any particular moment. So as maybe ineffective as the Americans are, we're lucky that they are still in a position of relative power and are using it.
Sure. Elizabeth and Mark, for now, thanks very much indeed. You're coming back at 1 o'clock, and we'll be joined by Sir Richard Barrons, the former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff as well. Thank you both very much indeed. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends, and we've lots more coming up on today's programme, including a trip down memory lane, as this weekend does indeed see, as we were just talking, about the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War. I'll be speaking to a top defence editor. But first, let's bring you up to date with the weather.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking fine for many, though a few showers with rain and hill snow in the north. Let's take a look at the details. The weather across southwest England will be similar to yesterday, with some cloud around, but also lengthy spells of sunshine in which it will feel reasonably warm. A few showers are possible. It's looking very similar around the southeast. Temperatures may be a little disappointing for the time of year, and there'll be some cloud. Any showers across Wales should ease this afternoon, meaning it will be mostly dry. In between the patches of cloud, we'll have some decent spring sunshine. Further showers are likely in the northwest of England this afternoon. They aren't expected to be particularly heavy, and many will avoid them. Temperatures will be a little down on the average for April. After a mostly sunny morning, it's likely to turn cloudier across parts of northeastern England as we head through the afternoon. It should stay dry for most, though, with only an isolated shower. Rain and hill snow will push southwards across Scotland this afternoon, perhaps turning heavy at times in the far north. Southern parts will stay drier and brighter for longest. Meanwhile, the sunshine across Northern Ireland is set to turn hazy this afternoon before some thicker cloud pushes in from the northwest. It should remain dry here, though. While southern parts will stay mostly fine to the end of the day, rain will sweep across the northern half of the UK, and that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day. My pedal is...
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome back. It's just coming up to 28 minutes past 12. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and friends here on GB News, TV and radio. This weekend marks 40 years since the start of the Falklands War. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentine forces invaded the British overseas territory of the Falkland Islands. Commemorations are going on across the country, and there are also plans for a special commemoration at the absolutely brilliant National Memorial Arboretum on the 14th of June. I'm delighted to be joined now by Con Coughlin, who is the defence editor and chief columnist at The Telegraph. Con, so good of you to join us. Thank you very much indeed. Going to come to the Falklands in a moment, but I was just talking to an old mutual mate of ours, Mark Seddon from Al Jazz and the United Nations, and Elizabeth Braw from RUSI about Ukraine. In all of your years as a defence and diplomacy commentator, have you seen a more complex and more intractable challenge than Russia v Ukraine?
I suppose one thinks of the Balkans campaigns in the 1990s, and I covered the Yugoslav conflict and Bosnia, and that was pretty complicated. But of course, at that point, Russia, which wanted to be involved, was very weak. So it was really a lot of what happened in the Balkans was because the West did not want to get involved. We sat on our hands, and the whole of Yugoslavia fell apart with Srebrenica and everything else. What is different, very different about this, is it's taking place in what is being described as a new Cold War. We have a newly militarized Russia with a president who is determined to reshape the boundaries of modern Europe by force. And that is a complete different ball game from what we faced at the end of the Cold War when Russia was very weak. So that, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything more complicated since the Balkans.
Yeah. And as I was talking to Mark and Elizabeth just before you were kind enough to join us, do you sense that there is a public frustration, a declining, not compassion, because people still clearly care about what's happening to the good folk of Ukraine, but with the cost of living crisis and all sorts of other stuff, and you've got a big interview in the paper today with Kwasi Kwarteng about trying to do something to get energy prices down, that's kind of taking over their focus, do you sense?
Well, you say that, Alistair, but here where I live down in Sussex, a lot of houses have ribbons denoting the Ukrainian flag. And somebody's even flying a flag from a flagpole of the Ukrainian flag. So, yes, of course, the cost of living crisis is going to be very painful, particularly for lower paid people. And we are all looking at astronomical energy bills for the foreseeable future. And a factor in that is the Russian conflict. And unfortunately, Europe's energy dependence on Russia. Now, I've been writing The Telegraph for a decade, saying it is absolute madness for Europe. To a lesser extent, us, we have very limited dependence on Russia for gas. But when you look at Germany and France and Italy, they are completely in hock to Russia to keep the lights on, basically. And why they've allowed this to happen, when it's been quite clear for a decade or more, and certainly since the Crimean invasion of 2014, that we are dealing with an old-fashioned despot in the Kremlin who's got a czarist mentality, who's completely crushed all opposition, murdered his opponents in some cases. In the case of Boris Nemtsov and, of course, Alexander Litvinenko here in London. But we've still done business with these people. So that's the folly. But coming back to your question, Alistair, I think there is a lot of public support for the Ukrainian cause. I think the great British public understand there's an important point of principle here, that you can't just go and invade a country because you don't agree with it. So I think people do support it. A lot of people are desperate to take in Ukrainians and give them sanctuary, and are very frustrated with the government, not because of energy prices, but because the Home Office can't get its act together over visas.
Yeah. And fascinating, it's a perfect segue. I mean, same issues as with the Falklands. You can't simply have an Argentine junta run by a bunch of nasty military people invading a territory that is not theirs, whatever they call it, the Malvinas. It is not theirs as a British protectorate. That's what the good people of the Falklands wanted. Thatcher read that clearly and dispatched the task force. Same again, not in Bosnia. That was about the breakup of Yugoslavia and who wanted what. But again, it was national interest and who wanted a bit of territory. Another war that we both covered and wrote about was exactly the same, and that was Iraq going into Kuwait. It's about grabbing stuff that's not yours.
Yeah, I mean, if we in the West and the Western democracies want to maintain our way of life, maintain our freedoms of choice, whatever they may be, our freedom to speak our minds, then these important principles have to be protected when they are challenged by rogue dictators, whether they are Galtieri in Argentina, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, or Vladimir Putin in Russia. And the great British public gets this. I mean, Margaret Thatcher's decision to liberate the Falklands was not popular politically. A lot of her own Conservative Party thought this was a great gamble. If you remember, the Reagan administration was very equivocal about it, and it took people like the then Defense Secretary, the U.S. Defense Secretary, Caspar Weinberger, to put some backbone in the American administration. But when you look back at it, the British public was actually behind the task force.
Yeah.
And as a lot of historians have written, and my former editor, Max Hastings, has a big piece today in the Sunday Times, recalling his role in the war. When you look back at it, it was a turning point for the British people because we stood up for freedom, and it gave us an enormous lift. And I think, in coming out of COVID, with the cost of living crisis, all the other issues we need to face, I think people feel buoyed inside to know that they are supporting the cause of freedom and a just cause in supporting Ukraine, just as they did with the Falklands.
Yeah. There's always a political upside to doing the right thing. Con Coughlin, a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. And come back and talk to us again. You're very welcome anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan.
Con Coughlin, one of the real giants, defence editor and chief columnist with The Telegraph, reflecting on the Falklands and also looking forward to what's going on in Ukraine. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends. We've plenty more still to come this afternoon, including we'll be taking a look at net zero and how the cost of living crisis could potentially change the priorities of this government. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the GB News. Here's Olivia Guthrie.
Alistair, thank you. It's 12:36. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. The Foreign Secretary says Russia's indiscriminate attacks on civilians in Ukraine must be investigated as war crimes. Liz Truss says there's increasing evidence of what she's calling appalling acts by retreating Russian forces in towns like Irpin and Bucha. Ms Truss insists the UK will not rest until those responsible for atrocities face justice in the International Criminal Court. The mayor of Bucha described Russian troops leaving the bodies of dead civilians in the
Corpses of executed people still line the Yabolsk street in Bucha. Their hands are tied behind their backs. We will record this page of our history and it will be used at their tribunal, but I wouldn't like to talk about that now. You should understand what emotion of relief we are feeling now.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said he's strengthening their defences in the east of the country. Overnight, plumes of smoke were seen over the southern city of Odessa after Russia claimed strikes destroyed an oil refinery and 3 fuel storages. The Kremlin's chief negotiator says peace talks with Ukraine aren't ready for top-level involvement yet, as they resume tomorrow. The Business Secretary says there could be a significant expansion in the UK's nuclear power capacity. In an interview with the Sunday Telegraph, Kwasi Kwarteng suggested there could be 6 or 7 new large-scale nuclear power stations in operation by 2050. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Alistair will be back in just a moment.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome back. It's just coming up to 21 and you are watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and friends here on GB News, TV and radio. I asked you to get in touch and you have answered on our big topics of the day, the idea of Ukraine fatigue, and if you think that net zero is more of a priority. Carol gets the conversation underway. Looking at the atrocities coming to light in Ukraine, I feel their plight takes precedence over my fears about the cost of living. We mustn't turn a blind eye and pretend it's not happening. That is not to say I have not shed tears about how I will manage. Mark joins in and says net zero feels like a luxury of a peaceful world where all nations can work together. To be honest, UK can't do it alone. It doesn't matter how much we do. If India, Russia, China don't stop, then it doesn't matter. The green agenda's great, but perhaps it's time to rethink the timescale. Thank you very much indeed for those and for others. I've only got time for 3 of them at the moment, but I will find time later on before we go off air at 2 o'clock for more of your views. So do keep them coming in and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are at GB News. Now, the cost of living crisis, not least the surge in energy prices, will hit all of our wallets and budgets. Might it also have another victim, the government's net zero policy on carbon reduction? The Prime Minister seems fixed on it, despite growing disquiet on his own backbenches. A good policy, perhaps, but not great timing, as one or two of you have already said in your emails and tweets to me. Well, Net Zero Watch is the pressure group, and they've been commissioning some polling, which is yet to come out, to find out if net zero is strengthening or weakening Britain's energy security. The results of the poll are expected to be released next week, so keep an eye out for that, as indeed will we. In the meantime, how does the group feel about the government announcement, not least in that interview in the Telegraph with Kwasi Kwarteng, that 7 nuclear power stations are to be commissioned and perhaps another wind farm in the Irish Sea? Joining me live now is Harry Wilkinson, who is head of policy at Net Zero Watch. Harry, first and foremost, before we come to the Kwasi Kwarteng and I think it's a big announcement on Thursday when all of the detail of this stuff is going to come out. Do you sense, as I do, that because of the cost of living crisis, the wind is slightly out of the sails of the net zero policy?
That's right. Thank you, Alistair. I think what I can say about our polling results, they've not been published yet, as you've said, but what I can say is I think people respect the desire to get to net zero. They want to reduce emissions. But actually, other things are taking priority right now. We've got a cost of living crisis. There's the Ukraine crisis, which means we're looking to diversify our energy supplies. So people agree with the objective, but they want the government to focus at the moment on the immediate priorities of getting bills down and making sure we don't rely on Putin's gas and oil so we can support the Ukrainians.
We are 100% on that, Harry, you and me, and many, many others beside. And I tell you, part of the problem with what Kwasi and the Prime Minister are going to say on Thursday, and it's in the Telegraph interview, is that 7 new nuclear power stations would add to our energy independence. We won't need stuff coming from elsewhere, whilst also being a good thing in terms of the green agenda. They're not going to be on stream until 2050 at the earliest. What the government could do right now, although it would have a sharp implication for the net zero campaign, would be to scrap green levies.
That's right. These go directly on people's bills, whereas they could be funded by general taxation or scrapped entirely. That's a different question, but I think getting them off bills, that's the immediate thing that they could do, because that hits the poorest hardest, because they use a relatively greater proportion of their income on energy prices. So this is a very regressive way of funding both renewable energy subsidies and energy efficiency measures.
Fracking's a different argument, and there's a huge body of opinion in support of fracking, and the private sector is ready to go, not least Quadrilla, but many other companies say we could do it right now. That would ease our dependence on other people for energy, but it wouldn't do anything to reduce the carbonisation of the atmosphere.
Well, actually, UK-produced gas has much lower emissions than shipping it in from elsewhere. With LNG, for example, you have to pressurize the gas, you then have to refrigerate it, transport it across, repressurize it. So there are many emissions associated with those processes. So actually having the gas here in the UK could actually help us reduce our emissions. And the Committee on Climate Change have acknowledged that actually we will need gas well into the future. And so actually using that gas from here can help us to reduce our emissions by reducing the footprint of our gas use, which will, of course, remain. And we have to remember that gas is the marginal generator. It sets the price of electricity in this country. So the one biggest thing that we can do to get both electricity prices down and, of course, the price of people heating their homes is to actually get gas prices down by expanding the supply. And that should hopefully have a very positive impact.
Do you think, and very briefly, it'd be kind enough, Harry, that this is, it's a ghastly cliche, but in this instance is actually absolutely spot on. This is a tipping point for the net zero agenda?
That's right. The government has to show now that it grasps the realities that people are facing in terms of the rising bills. Unless they put that first, and actually say that net zero has to be put to one side for the time being as we get bills down, then I think people will really question where this government's focus is on. Is it in the sort of ultra-green sort of circles of Westminster where you find that desire to reach net zero trumps everything else, or are they going to put their efforts and engagement in terms of dealing with energy prices and the enormous knock-on impacts that they have for the whole country? It's clear where their focus should be to me, and it sounds like it is to you. So people will be really looking out to whether the government can fix this problem.
We'll watch that with great interest, and when you've got the result of that polling data, you give us a bell as well, and we'll talk again. Meantime, Harry, thank you very much indeed. Harry Wilkinson, Director of Policy at Net Zero Watch. If you disagree with him or with me, then do email us or send us a tweet, and we'll share some of those before the end of the programme. Now, for those who live in towns and cities, it can be easy to lose touch with what's going on in the countryside and the world of farming and agriculture. So most weeks we check in with those at the forefront of our rural communities. And with that in mind, this week we're going to be looking at farming and the price of everyday food essentials like bread and milk amidst the cost of living crisis. The peg for this is when I was standing in for Liam Halligan the other day on his brilliant On the Money programme. And one of my guests there was Jasmine Birtles, who is a personal finance expert. And Jasmine said to me as we both came out of the studio, we are really now focusing, not only us at moneymagpie.com, which is her website, but a number of her friends about the cost of living crisis and what we can do by way of self-sufficiency. So visions of her rolling up her sleeves and putting the rubber gloves on and digging and planting bulbs. I said, we've got to talk about that. And she said, you're on. I'll come in this weekend. Jasmine, great to see you. And thank you very... Do you remember the conversation?
Yes.
How did my jaw hit the ground? Food prices clearly are rocketing, but you reckon that we can do more to help ourselves?
Well, yes. You see, I have been, as you say, I've been talking to a number of friends about the various problems that we have with farming in this country. Farmers, I think, are not being supported as they should be. They're being told to rewild. They're being told to turn a lot of their fields into energy producing crops, as you've just been talking about, and this is not helping with our food crisis. And what we have been talking about, as you say, is learning how to become self-sufficient ourselves. Maybe setting up small holdings around the country, kind of really going in the opposite direction to the way farming has been going recently, where really, honestly, small farmers have been, I think they've been discouraged to continue so that the big factory farms can take over. That's the way it seems to me as a townie. I have to say I am a townie.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And a very dear friend of mine, Tracy Crouch, the Conservative MP down in Kent, she's one of the growing army of allotment addicts and loves it. And there's the bonus of not only growing her own vegetables that she loves, but she takes her son down there and they dig and weed together, and then they take it back home, yes. and lo and behold, that produces lunch for them. But there's a deeper point here, isn't there? Because when you and I were talking on Liam's programme on Thursday, Friday, whenever it was, I said to you, I think, generally speaking, we can do a heck of a lot more to help ourselves, whether it's the energy crisis, rising fuel bills that we've been talking about just now. We've almost forgotten that old-fashioned way of helping yourself, and things like domestic science is no longer taught in schools. Maybe it should be.
Well, I do think so, because I've been thinking this week that one of the big problems for vulnerable families is that quite often there isn't somebody there who knows how to cook. And if you don't know how to cook, you really are going to be wasting so much money each week by buying in pre-prepared food or takeaways, etc. And you're probably not going to have the nutrition that you really need. So yes, I totally agree. I think we do need to have domestic science taught in schools again for boys and girls. We need to have more charities. I think there are some charities that are helping to teach people to cook, but I think they need more support. We need more of that. And yes, as you say, those of us that can cook, we need to do that. We need to be cooking from raw. This is one of the basic tips that we give out, which of course loads of people already know, of course. But sometimes we need reminding that really is a good way to save money. As you say, if you have a garden or if you can get an allotment, wow! I mean, in where I live in West London, there's a huge queue for allotments. But even if you've got a balcony to grow some herbs, grow some tomatoes, etc., it all helps. It's only a small amount, but hey, it all helps.
Cress and mustard going right back to school and blotting paper. Jasmine, I knew it was going to be a good conversation when we talked about it before the weekend started. You stay in touch. Thank you very much indeed. Jasmine Birtles there with some really brilliant advice, and there's lots more on her magpie.com website as well. Just try and help yourself save a little bit of money. Goodness me, we all need it these days. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends, and we've more still to come on the programme this afternoon as we take you right up until 2 o'clock, including the latest from a very special friend of this programme on their journey to deliver aid to Ukrainian refugees. But first, let's bring you up to date with your weather.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking fine for many, though a few showers with rain and hill snow in the north. Let's take a look at those details. The weather across southwest England will be similar to yesterday, with some cloud around, but also lengthy spells of sunshine in which it will feel reasonably warm. A few showers are possible. It's looking very similar around the southeast. Temperatures may be a little disappointing for the time of year, and there'll be some cloud. Any showers across Wales should ease this afternoon, meaning it will be mostly dry. In between the patches of cloud, we may have some decent spring sunshine. Further showers are likely in the northwest of England this afternoon. They aren't expected to be particularly heavy, and many will avoid them. Temperatures will be a little down on average for April. After a mostly sunny morning, it's likely to turn cloudier across parts of northeastern England as we head through the afternoon. It should stay dry for most, though, with only an isolated shower. Rain and hill snow will push southwards across Scotland this afternoon, perhaps turning heavy at times in the far north. Southern parts will stay drier and brighter for longest. Meanwhile, the sunshine across Northern Ireland is set to turn hazy this afternoon before some thicker cloud pushes in from the northwest. It should remain dry here, though. While southern parts will stay mostly fine to the end of the day, rain will sweep across the northern half of the UK, and that's how the weather's shaping up for the rest of the day.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome back. It's 3.5 minutes, I've just been told in my ear, quite specifically to 1 o'clock, and you're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends here on GBNews TV and radio. Now, a few weeks ago, a couple of friends of mine from the equestrian world decided they wanted to do their bit to help the people of Ukraine. Stephen Barnes and Matt Millen launched their mission to Poland with 9 big lorries and a lot of goodwill. Since then, they've raised £50,000 and Ukraine Equestrian Relief is now recognised as a registered charity due to the sheer levels of support and recognition that they've received across the country. They're now able to fund their next trip out there, and I'm delighted to say that Stephen Barnes, co-founder of Ukraine Equestrian Relief, joins me live now. Welcome back. It's wonderful when a good idea becomes a real thing. Tell me, have I got all of that right in the introduction, where Ukraine Equestrian Relief is right now? Up and running and established?
Yeah, we've made the application, or we're in the process of doing that, and we'll become a registered charity very soon.
Was mainly to load up these great big lorries that you and I and everybody else in the equestrian world know normally move beautiful horses around from one event to another, load it up with blankets, with food, with other stuff that people want.
Yeah, we took 9 trucks over to Poland. We arrived at the Polish border, first of all, and unloaded the initial 9 trucks full of aid. That's a picture of us on the way there. Once we'd actually unloaded all 9 trucks, we then took the trucks to 3 separate refugee centres where we filled them again at local stores with as much food and as much aid as we could possibly fit in those trucks. And we delivered those again to those reception centres. And we were lucky enough to meet some of the refugees along that journey, actually.
Give me a sense of what their reaction was to it, because when they see somebody who's got a kind of red cross on their arm or someone with Oxfam on their cap, but when you lot, we're seeing lovely pictures for people who are consuming this via radio rather than television, lovely bunch of people with their equestrian gear on who suddenly turn up with those beautiful lorries. What was the reaction from the Ukrainian people?
You know, Alistair, they were massively overwhelmed. You know, there's obviously the language barriers, but I must have hugged 40, 50 different refugees, and they just come up to you and say thank you. And also, I think what was really, really surprising as well is the Polish people, in the midst of helping these Ukrainian folk out, they were hugely overwhelmed as well. We had, you know, the army emotional and in tears. We had police escorts. They came to meet us when they found out what we were doing. We had loads of support off the Polish people. They were fantastic. And, you know, through that whole trip, any obstacle we came across, people were there to fix it for us. It worked really, really well.
You've done well on sponsors, and some big names in the equestrian world have come on board as well. But you need 10 grand for the next trip.
We were 10 grand short last night. Great news, by this morning, we've pretty much got there, and we should get the next convoy on the road from Friday. We'll be taking at least 6, possibly 9 trucks again. We'll then start saving for the next convoy, and we've had some great people in the equestrian world and the wider sort of public come forwards and donate or get organised. They've been doing fundraising for us. They've been making pledges. It's been amazing. The support we've had is really tremendous, and there's a lot of people behind this now.
Brilliant, and people can find Equestrian Relief online. Final question, it's been on my mind ever since I first spoke to Matt about it. Did the woman who accidentally put her house and car keys in her coat, which then went in with the other clothes that was going to be given to the refugees, did she get her keys back?
That particular delivery of aid went into Ukraine. I believe her keys are currently in Ukraine somewhere. So, but she was great about it, and we've sorted that out.
Well, I hope somebody managed to give her a lift back. Steve, I think what you've done, and Matt and the rest of you, is really, really brilliant. We began the programme talking about people maybe just losing a little bit of faith in what we're trying to do to help the people of Ukraine and those particularly in Poland. But you're a breath of fresh air. And give my best to Matt when you next talk to him, and the very best to you and the whole family. Thank you very much indeed for what you've done and for joining us again this afternoon.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.
Good bloke, good charity. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and friends on GB News. We've plenty more still to come as we just drift past 1 minute past one. Stay with us. Hello and welcome. If you've just joined us, the time is 1.5 minutes past one, and I'm Alastair Stewart, and we are into the final hour of our programme today. I'll be keeping you company here on TV and on radio, and we've plenty more still to come, including more on our top discussion about the Ukraine crisis, but also on issues closer to home that affect me and you directly: the energy crisis, the cost of essential food items. I'll be joined once again by Mark Seddon and Elizabeth Braw, who were here at the top of the programme at midday, and joining them as well in conversation will be the former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, General Sir Richard Barrons. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the GB News. Here, once again, is Olivia Guthrie.
Alistair, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 2 minutes past one. Here's your latest headlines in the GB newsroom. The Foreign Secretary says Russia's indiscriminate attacks on civilians in Ukraine must be investigated as war crimes. Liz Truss says there's increasing evidence of what she's calling appalling acts by retreating Russian forces in towns like Irpin and Bucha. Ms Truss insists the UK will not rest until those responsible for atrocities face justice in the International Criminal Court. The mayor of Bucha described Russian troops leaving the bodies of dead civilians in the streets of the town.
Corpses of executed people still line the Yablsk street in Bucha. Their hands are tied behind their backs. We will record this page of our history and it will be used at their tribunal, but I wouldn't like to talk about that now. You should understand what emotion of relief we are feeling now.
Well, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's strengthening their defences in the east of the country after continued Russian missile attacks overnight. Plumes of smoke were seen over the southern city of Odessa after Russia's defence ministry claims strikes have destroyed an oil refinery and 3 fuel storages there. Ukrainian officials say several rockets have also hit the seaport of Mykolaiv this morning. The Kremlin's chief negotiator says peace talks with Ukraine aren't ready for top-level involvement yet as they resume tomorrow. President Zelensky says Moscow wants to take control of the east of Ukraine.
We're strengthening our defences in the east of the Donbass. We're aware the enemy has resources to put pressure on the eastern part of the country. What is the aim of the Russian armed forces? They want to seize both the Donbass and the south of our country. What's our aim? To defend our freedom, our land, our people. To do everything to repel them.
Well, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister says work is ongoing to try to get civilians out of Mariupol. Irina Vereshchuk says with the assistance of the Red Cross, buses are attempting to get as close as possible to the besieged city, but the situation on the ground is volatile. Tens of thousands of residents are trapped there with food and water in short supply. Boris Johnson has held discussions with President Zelensky overnight, congratulating Ukraine's military pushback of Russia's advance. Downing Street says the Prime Minister also repeated his assurances the UK will step up its support. President Zelensky says he would welcome Britain's help in diplomatic efforts to end the war. The Business Secretary says there could be a significant expansion in the UK's nuclear power capacity. In an interview with the Sunday Telegraph, Kwasi Kwarteng suggested there could be 6 or 7 new large-scale nuclear power stations in operation by 2050, producing as much as a quarter of our energy needs. Speaking this morning, Cabinet Minister Grant Shapps said the government has ruled out rationing energy in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Chancellor's been urged to set out an emergency budget to help people across the UK who are struggling with the rising cost of living. The SNP's Alison Thewlis is calling on Rishi Sunak to provide a generous grant for those she says will be plunged into poverty and hardship. She's demanding action from the government as bills and national insurance payments increase. Economist Vicky Price has told GB News Mr Sunak can't ignore the hardship people are going to face.
People are going to be very dissatisfied in the year ahead, and it will mean for the Chancellor that if people do not go out and spend as much as they otherwise would, you have to rethink his growth forecast, for example, already reduced very substantially from 6% to 3.8% for this year. Will they have to be reduced even further? And if that is the case, then he's going to be collecting a lot less in tax as well. So he's got an incentive to ensure that people feel confident that they go out and spend. But we're actually seeing already consumer confidence decline.
Pakistan's president has dissolved parliament and called early elections following an opposition attempt to remove Prime Minister Imran Khan from office. It comes after a no-confidence vote in Mr Khan was blocked by Parliament's deputy speaker. The former cricketer, who was elected in 2018, believes the move to oust him was orchestrated by the US, a claim Washington denies. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to Alistair.
Olivia, thanks very much indeed. It's 7 minutes past 1. I am Alastair Stewart, and until 2 o'clock I'll be keeping you company along with friends and friendly guests. Still to come, however ghastly it is, are you growing frustrated with the crisis in Ukraine? Mark Seddon and Elizabeth Braw are back with me in the studio to discuss that, and I'm delighted to say that we will be joined by a new guest as well. We'll be speaking to the former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Richard Barrons, to get his military take on the situation. Plus, although they sound greener and less damaging to our planet, electric cars are likely to prove far more expensive than our average runaround fueled by petrol or diesel. In fact, over £700 a year more expensive. I'll be discussing that plus more as we continue the conversation on the cost of living crisis. And after an investigation into the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS Trust showed hundreds of avoidable infant deaths, I'll be asking how we can make maternity care in the UK safer. As always, GB News is all about you, our viewers. Any burning questions or stories that you think we need to cover, no matter how big or small they may appear, we genuinely want to hear them. So to get your voice heard, email gbviews@gbnews.uk and do put Alastair Stewart in the subject line. So, Mark Seddon, formerly of Tribune magazine and also the United Nations, is here again, and I'm delighted that Elizabeth Braw's come back in too. Elizabeth used to be with RUSI and is now with the American Institute. And joining the three of us down the line is General Sir Richard Barrons, former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff. General Richard, thank you so much for joining us. We were talking earlier on about the notion of public fatigue and even the world of journalism taking its eye off the ball in Ukraine. Do you sense that as well, and does it matter?
So I do sense it. I think it's a natural feature of the way we like to lead our lives, but it's also a huge mistake if that meant that politically and militarily we took our eyes off Ukraine. That the fight in Ukraine is important to us, our prosperity, our security, and it's about our long-term relationship with a very difficult Russia. So we should absolutely not think there is any scope at all to reduce our commitment to getting the best outcome we can in Ukrainian circumstances.
My two guests here, Mark and Elizabeth, were concerned that the prospects for a diplomatic negotiated settlement didn't look terribly promising, whether the UN was up to the job or not. Mark was very interesting on that as someone who used to work there and report upon it. Is it your view as a former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff here in the UK that this is a situation that can only be resolved militarily?
Well, I'll make 2 points. The first point is neither side in this war is done with fighting it. I mean, neither side has really won and neither side has really lost. And so they think there is more to be gained by continuing to fight. And I think that's probably so. And the second thing is, eventually, most wars, they aren't end in a crushing victory. They come to an end by discussion. But that discussion occurs when one or other party feels that it won't get any more out of violence. And we're not at that point yet.
Yeah, you've dealt directly with the United Nations yourself when you were serving in the Balkans. Does it surprise you that they don't seem to be on the diplomatic field of battle right now?
Not really, for two reasons. The first is there clearly would be a split in the Security Council, so getting the sort of resolution you need for a decisive UN role, I think, would be very, very difficult. And the UN will also see this war hasn't played out, and it really doesn't have much form of intervening in a war that's underway. And the other point I'd make is, were the UN to consider, for example, putting in a peacekeeping force, you'd have to ask, well, who is good enough, big enough, and risky enough to want to do that? And these operations take generally at least 6 months to get going. So this is a distant prospect.
General Sir Richard, the next voice you'll hear is Elizabeth Braw.
Yes, and I wanted to come in on the point about whether the United Nations can do anything at this point. It seems as if this would be an opening for UN Secretary General if we had a powerful Secretary General. And this is the design flaw of the United Nations, that the Secretary General is usually a relatively low-key or low-profile person, simply because the member states can't agree on anybody else, the members of, especially of the Security Council. So if we had a powerful person as Secretary General, he or she could step in with their own political mandate, as it were, but we don't have that.
And as a former UN man, the other point that General Sir Richard makes, which is really important, is who would wear the blue berets anyway?
True. But of course, you have to look back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. There have been Secretary Generals in the past, such as Uthant, who really had a political idea of what they needed to do to settle that particular crisis. Also, Dag Hammarskjöld, who took such a personal risk that he ended up being killed over the Congo, if you recall.
Yes, I do.
But what we're not seeing from this Secretary General, even before the invasion happened, was a proactive desire to get involved and take risks himself. And okay, he will say, well, I was going to put Rosemary DiCarlo, my head of the political and the peacekeeping, in, but the Russians said no. The Russians said I'm biased because I've talked about it being an invasion. But to my mind, you can't. I mean, I understand what Sir Richard is saying, but you can't wait for things to play out, for two sides to get exhausted. You have to bring about some kind of ceasefire and some kind of peace, however imperfect that is. You've got the beginning of the humanitarian corridors, by the way. I mean, that's the beginning of the process. But there's a hell of a lot more to go. And we're not really seeing it from this Secretary-General, in my view.
General Sir Richard, do you want to come back on that? I mean, the idea, your key point, that we may not be at the point in the conflict where the time is ripe for a UN intervention. And Mark mentions the Red Cross. I mean, the Red Cross, not even the Red Cross, with its badges of protection and its UN status, can get those poor souls out of Mariupol.
Yeah, this is so. So I think from the Russian perspective, having mounted so far a very poor and very brutal campaign, they're now clearly resetting their military campaign around more limited objectives. And those objectives seem to include taking more territory in the east of Ukraine and very likely also trying to take the entire Black Sea coast, including Odessa. That's some way off yet. So they'll feel that if there was some sort of ceasefire now, it would fall short of what they may see as their minimum objectives. And from a Ukrainian perspective, they've done better than they anticipated. They've seen the recent success of easing the Russians out of thinking they could take Kyiv, but they know there's a lot of fighting to come in the Donbass and in the south, and they would worry too that a ceasefire now might stabilize a front line to their considerable disadvantage. And so I think set aside the humanitarian aspects of this, which are just dreadful, and we recognize that Russia is using the Ukrainian civil population as a weapon of war to terrorize Ukraine into doing less or stopping. This has got a long way to go, yeah.
Mark Sutton.
Yes, I mean, you know, the problem, of course, is looking, to my mind, just as a kind of military campaign from both sides' perspectives. You kind of, unfortunately, ignore the possibility of more terrible things happening, and a defensive and rather humiliated Russian military and president doing their worst. We've already seen what they're capable of doing to Mariupol. Is this allowed to grind on? How many more civilians have got to lose their lives? How many more cities have got to be ground into dust? And above all else, we've had the threat of the use of nuclear weapons from the Russians, a most extraordinary thing. And that would really make you think this is this is the big testing point for this Secretary-General.
Sure.
More than any other conflict, actually. This is a big test because of the superpower involvement and because of the threat of the use of nuclear weapons.
General Sir Richard, were you as surprised and shocked as I was when, for the first time in my memory, a United States president used the language of the possibility of first strike nuclear weaponry? I wasn't remotely surprised when Putin said, I retain the right to use my nuclear weapons in defence of my essential national interests. But for Biden to say, we could even contemplate first use, first strike, did that shock you?
Well, to an extent, but we need to recognise that the low state of relationships between these nuclear-armed powers, and I think we should recognise that one of the features of the Ukraine conflict is it has brought nuclear weapons firmly back onto the agenda, both from the tactical through the theatre level, right up to strategic level, and I think this is a terrible place to be. But it does indicate that this struggle in Ukraine is at its heart a struggle between Russia and the West. And the West is coming at this from, I think, a very poor place, having allowed this situation to develop over about 10 years. So for as long as it takes to reset the balance with Russia on terms that the West is much more comfortable with and has indeed determined, we are going to fall back on this ultimate sanction of nuclear weapons, and that's a mad place to be.
Incredibly profound and important words from a former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff. You're an expert in deterrence. It ain't working now.
It's not. And the reason it's not working is that Russia doesn't care about its reputation. Or I should say, Vladimir Putin doesn't care about Russia's reputation. If you're a respectable country, you at least pretend to stick by the rules, international rules, international conventions, and Russia is not doing that. We should remember yesterday it came out that they have put landmines in areas that they are leaving, landmines that are designed to harm civilians. This is not what a respectable country does. And I would raise the point that we could reach a point where senior Russian officials, senior military officers say, well, I'm a proud Russian officer, I'm a proud Russian diplomat, whatever it may be, but this is not what we are about as a country. This is beyond the pale, and now is the time to perhaps engineer a coup. I'm not saying it's likely, but I'm saying that surely there are 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 or 7 people who will say to themselves and one another, this is not. We have gone beyond what we should, what we can defend as a country in targeting Ukrainian civilians, deliberately targeting these civilians.
General Sir Richard, can I bring you back in at that point, and as it were, from nuclear to conventional? One of the pieces I read in the newspapers this morning that caused me grave concern, and either confirm, if you will, that I'm right to be concerned or put me right. The Russian Defense Ministry is warning that our military aid that we send in, which the Prime Minister and President Zelensky spoke overnight, we understand from Olivia's news bulletin, but the military aid that the United Kingdom is now wanting to send in to help the Ukrainians is a legitimate target on the way in and whilst in use against tanks, aircraft and helicopters.
So we're again on this question, what is it that the West can do to support Ukraine that does not cause this war to change from what it is now, a war between Russia and Ukraine, and what it could become if not very carefully handled, which is a war between Russia and the West, in particular NATO. So let's be absolutely clear. If the UK provides weapons to Ukraine, as soon as they're in Ukraine, they're on the pitch, they're fair game. If they were to be targeted anywhere inside NATO, that would be a breach of Article 5 and could lead to the escalation of this war, to a war between Russia and the West. A war Russia could not win, and Russia knows that very well. So we want to be mindful of the rhetoric, but absolutely clear that Russian targeting on NATO territory is a breach of NATO Article 5. It means there's a war between Russia and the West.
For what I can only guess, I would have thought the Russians are very aware of all of this. They must be aware of their limitations too. I mean, I got it horribly wrong, like a lot of other people, because I didn't think they'd be foolish enough to invade Ukraine. I actually thought before we were talking earlier that actually Putin was on his way to getting some of his demands met without moving a single tank across the border. But we are where we are, and you know, it's also quite possible, because we've seen in our lifetime the fall of the Soviet Union almost overnight. The Berlin Wall came down. Things can move very quickly in a country where it's usually quite glacial, as in Russia. But at the same time, it's horrendously dangerous to hear these discussions, because you really do wonder, where are the people of peace? Because these are the people who are most needed now, to my mind. We've got to get negotiations underway. Seriously, I know they're going to start again tomorrow, but this constant ratcheting up, it just leaves us very exposed. And just finally, one of the reasons I think we're in such a dangerous place is that multilateralism is fraying badly at the edges. And we saw this under President Trump. He ripped up the nuclear treaty, if you recall. The intermediate, Sir Richard will know far more than I do about that. But we've seen an assault on multilateralism, countries going their own way, and also Russia seeing what happened with Iraq, for instance, saying, well, they did it there, we can do it here. So we've got to get, you know, a consistency back to an international order, to my mind.
Final thought from you. I saw your head nodding in sage agreement with that last point that General Sir Richard was making. I mean, in effect, a proxy war between NATO members and Russia almost by accident.
That is the risk, which is why...
And that's a huge risk.
It is, and that's why it's so dangerous to see... it's so dangerous that citizens of NATO member states are going into Ukraine to fight on the Ukrainian side. They are doing it with the best of intentions, and the Ukrainians deserve all the support they can get. But what happens if these soldiers get killed, even though they are fighting in a personal capacity? They haven't been sent by the UK government or any other Western government. Nevertheless, the fact that they have citizenship in our countries brings our countries one step closer towards this sort of accidental escalation that would be extremely dangerous.
And Mark Seddon, thank you both very much in the studio, not once but twice. Very good of you. And General Sir Richard Barrons, a pleasure to talk to you as always. Thank you for your wisdom and your experience, and thanks for joining us down the line from the noble and brilliant county of Hampshire. I shall be there myself a little later this afternoon. God bless, and thank you very much indeed. I hope that helped you understand. Maybe I'm wrong about the dangers of people growing a little tired of it, but goodness me, what an extraordinary agenda there with Mark, Elizabeth and General Sir Richard. We've plenty more still to come in the last half hour or so of Alastair Stewart and Friends. After the break, after that investigation into the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS Trust showed that hundreds of avoidable infant deaths occurred, I'll be asking how we can make maternity care in the United Kingdom safer. But first, let's bring you up to date with the weather.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking fine for many, though a few showers with rain and hill snow in the north. Let's take a look at those details. The weather across southwest England will be similar to yesterday, with some cloud around, but also lengthy spells of sunshine in which it will feel reasonably warm. A few showers are possible. It's looking very similar around the southeast. Temperatures may be a little disappointing for the time of year, and there'll be some cloud. Any showers across Wales should ease this afternoon, meaning it will be mostly dry. In between the patches of cloud, we may have some decent spring sunshine. Further showers are likely in the northwest of England this afternoon. They aren't expected to be particularly heavy, and many will avoid them. Temperatures will be a little down on average for April. After a mostly sunny morning, it's likely to turn cloudier across parts of northeastern England as we head through the afternoon. It should stay dry for most, though, with only an isolated shower. Rain and hill snow will push southwards across Scotland this afternoon, perhaps turning heavy at times in the far north. Southern parts will stay drier and brighter for longest. Meanwhile, the sunshine across Northern Ireland is set to turn hazy this afternoon before some thicker cloud pushes in from the northwest. It should remain dry here, though. While southern parts will stay mostly fine to the end of the day, rain will sweep across the northern half of the UK, and that's how the weather's shaping up for the rest of the day.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome back. It's just coming up to 28 minutes past 1, and you're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends here on GBNews TV and radio. And MPs called for an independent organisation to be brought in to oversee improvements at Shropshire's under-fire maternity services. A report, I'm sure you're aware, found that catastrophic failings at Shrewsbury and Telford NHS Hospitals Trust contributed to hundreds of babies' deaths and not a few mothers as well over 20 years. Among its key findings were that there was an undue focus on so-called natural births, a culture where mistakes were not investigated, parents were not listened to, and that the Trust failed to learn from its mistakes. Joining me now, I'm delighted to say, is Nikki Wilson. Nikki's the Chief Executive Officer of Make Birth Better. It's an organisation that helps new parents, and Nikki is also a survivor of postnatal post-traumatic stress disorder. Nikki, we wanted to talk to you because it seems that Make Birth Better, all of those issues I've just read out that came from that extraordinary 5-year inquiry, is basically your agenda.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Alistair. Thank you for having me. That is our agenda. As you say, it's all in the name, to make birth better. And of course, the Ockenden report has been devastating and shocking for all of us to read.
Karen Brady writes in today's Sun newspaper, a very high-profile businesswoman and obviously a telly star as well. And it really is quite shocking, saying that maternity care in this country right now still isn't safe. And in one or two of the papers, there's a report that suggests that 2 in 5 births are likely not to go well. I mean, those are just staggering and dreadful statistics.
Yes, they are staggering, and they're not new. So we know that, in fact, we estimate that around 40% of women and birthing people in this country find their birth in some way deeply distressing. And we know that this situation is something that's been happening 4 decades. The campaign we're currently running, called No More Excuses, which is specifically in response to the Ockenden report, is essentially trying to draw attention to the fact that what has happened and what we know about from Telford and Shrewsbury is in part unique, but it is representative of issues that are systemic across the whole of maternity services.
Is it fair to say, as one or two of the newspapers have done, and I think Karen implies it in her essay as well, that this is a fundamental clash between those women who say, look, I'll have whatever drugs, whatever procedures, anything that's going to make it easier and safer for me, and the group, and I don't want to be unkind to them, but as it were, the natural childbirth trust tendency. I was at a book launch the other night, and I was talking to a senior midwife there who was the auntie of the guy who'd written the book, and she said it's like a religious split, and there's no coming together between the two camps.
Yeah. There have historically been a lot of dichotomies in the birth world, and of course there has been trends and phases for certain types of birth to be preferred, and of course a long-held cultural belief that vaginal birth is best. I would, of course, one of the issues that's come out of this report is that in this trust there was a pervasive belief that caesarean sections should be limited. I only butt in because when I read the report and read the coverage of it, I was trying to get my head round. I mean, I'm the father of 4 children and talked to my wife about it as well. But whether it was the degree to which it was an NHS trust trying to save money, because clearly a major operation like a caesarean section, that takes staff, it takes money and so on, or whether it was this philosophical difference. And my wife said, I think it's more the philosophical difference. Yes, I would say so, because in Shrewsbury and Telford, what we saw there were averages that were different to the rest of the whole country, and yet they were not disproportionately underfunded. So, of course, in this case, what we saw was a very strong cultural preoccupation with minimising intervention. But
I'm glad you clarified that. Final question. We could literally go on all afternoon because it's such a profound issue. And thanks for coming on board. And we'll do it again, Nikki, I hope, at some stage. But the other issue that came up in many of the debates that I joined in post that report was that when it comes to pregnancy, and it's almost a mantra, a political, philosophical mantra, it is a woman's right to choose. If it is about whether it's a woman's right to choose continue with a pregnancy, it jolly well should be a woman's right to choose how she has her birth.
Yes, absolutely. And all births are valid. This is a societal shift that we need to move around to wholly and truly understand. It doesn't matter how your baby is born. It's still birth. What's really, really important from this report, however, is that we address all the issues, including the chronic and systemic underfunding of maternity services, which is what our No More Excuses campaign is about. So please do visit our website and look that up at makebirthbetter.org.
It's a brilliant website, and we did that this morning, and most of my team were inspired by it. And thank you for joining us this afternoon, Nikki, and you keep in touch. Love to talk to you again.
Thank you.
That's
Thank you,
Nikki Wilson, the CEO of Make Birth Better, and that's the name of the website as well, so do look it up. You may agree or disagree, but we just like people to read good stuff on it, and it's very, very strong and well produced. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends, and we've plenty more still to come in the final half hour of the programme, including speaking to a Ukrainian MP about the feelings on the ground as the crisis there in Ukraine continues. Back here in the UK, we'll also be discussing electric cars. Sound great, but they're going to be 720 quid a year more expensive to run than a petrol or diesel car. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the GB News. Here's Olivia Guthrie.
Alistair, thank you. It's coming up to 1:35. Here's the latest headlines in the GB newsroom. The Foreign Secretary says Russia's indiscriminate attacks on civilians in Ukraine must be investigated as war crimes. Liz Truss says there's increasing evidence of what she's calling appalling acts by retreating Russian forces in towns like Irpin and Bucha. Ms Truss insists the UK will not rest until those responsible for atrocities face justice in the International Criminal Court. The mayor of Bucha described Russian troops leaving the bodies of dead civilians in the streets of the town.
Corpses of executed people still line the Yabolsk street in Bucha. Their hands are tied behind their backs. We will record this page of our history and it will be used at their tribunal, but I wouldn't like to talk about that now. You should understand what emotion of relief we are feeling now.
Ukrainian officials say several rockets have hit the seaport of Mykolaiv today. It's after the country's President Volodymyr Zelensky said he's strengthening their defences in the east. Plumes of smoke were seen over the southern city of Odessa after Russia claimed strikes destroyed an oil refinery and 3 fuel storages there. The Kremlin's chief negotiator says peace talks with Ukraine aren't ready for top-level involvement yet. They resume tomorrow. A new treatment for liver cancer, which isolates the organ and protects other parts of the body, has been found to be effective in nearly 90% of patients. The involves using small balloons to divert blood past the liver while directly delivering drugs into the organ. It's being pioneered in the UK at the University Hospital Southampton. TV, online and DAB plus radio. This is GB News. We'll have more at the top of the hour. Now it's back to Alastair Stewart.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Hello and welcome back. You're watching Alastair Stewart and Friends here on GB News TV and radio, where it is everywhere, 22 minutes to 2. And we've got more still to come. We spoke in depth in the last hour about the future of net zero. Might it just be the victim of this energy crisis as you and I and everybody else pay a heck of a lot more to turn the lights on and keep the heating going, particularly by the end of the month? Well, changing the way that we do so much is really at the heart of it. The way we drive our cars and get ourselves around the country is as much a part of it as anything to save the planet and all the rest of it. But it does come at a cost. The Sun newspaper has reported this morning that a Europe-wide survey has taken place to look at the rewards that are available from driving an electric vehicle. And the UK came out in the bottom 2 countries. In fact, here it's going to be about 720 quid more expensive to drive an electric car than a normal petrol powered car. Well, joining me now to discuss that is the editorial director of What Car magazine, Jim Holder, who is in favour of the move to electric cars. Aren't we all? But not if it's a case of cutting off my my motoring nose to spite my face, as it were. I mean, this is a wake-up call, isn't it, to the industry and to the government?
Yeah, I think someone needs to look very closely at the data from this survey. I have to say I'm slightly sceptical of some of the findings from it, but I think what we do appreciate is that going electric and buying an electric car does tend to cost more upfront. They're more expensive to buy initially or lease. But the point is the running costs are much, much lower, not just for the electricity. If you're charging at home, are saving around a fifth to at least a half over the cost of were you using petrol or diesel, but also things like free road tax, massive company car tax savings, congestion charge savings. So while this survey looks at the year one costs, and I think it would be a fair reflection that you are going to pay more up front, the savings pour in further down the line. And if you use an electric car to its best advantage, the savings over the whole life of owning that car are significant.
Sure. And as any economist would tell us, and I suspect we both know it anyway, given what we both do for a living, is that the best way of getting the big cost, i.e. buying the car in the first place, down is demand. If people read this unchallenged data, and I completely take your point, always question data and question every opinion poll, they're going to think, well, maybe I'll put it off, maybe I'll defer it. I watched an absolutely brilliant little programme on telly last night, which featured a new electric car which was covered not in paint and lovely pretty windows, but with solar panels, so that you charge as you drive around. That made fantastic sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting, some of the technology that's coming. As you say, as more people buy these electric vehicles, so that the billions of R&D investment follows through and you get some really quite innovative and radical solutions. I think we've seen some of the mainstream manufacturers doing things like putting solar panels on the roofs before. I think the challenge there is the cost of those solar panels for the amount of energy that they recoup, particularly in a country that, like the UK, that's not famous for being bathed in sunshine. But I think the exciting thing is perhaps not that we're going to see cars covered in solar panels on our roads everywhere in the next few years. But this kind of technology, of course, you have to start somewhere. And if there are pioneers out there creating these super exciting but expensive niche vehicles, then that technology can in time drip feed onto our more mainstream vehicles. And yes, the idea of solar panels on the roof, really exciting.
Yeah, you're aware of it as well. I think it's called Lightyear One was the name of the product, and it was from Holland, as you rightly point out. And the point, the guy from Lightyear One, the company, and it was his company, you would say, wouldn't he? He made it quite strongly as a point, was that amongst the Dutch folk, there was a more natural tendency to want to do the right thing about climate warming and all the rest of it, and that was one of the reasons why he thought it was going to go brilliantly well in the Netherlands, even though their sunlight levels may not be as high as, say, Spain or Italy.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great culture there, of course, led by cycling towards environmentalism and perhaps living life slightly differently. But we shouldn't do ourselves down here in the UK. Our share of battery electric vehicles in some months has topped 25% new electrified registrations. We're making good progress. I think 2030 for that first deadline that we have is still ambitious given the infrastructure we have out there. But if we keep pushing hard, these things are possible. And of course, we have to welcome new technology and innovations along the road. We have to be adaptable in our thinking to try and create the opportunities to reduce pollution and get towards those net zero targets, as you say.
Yeah. One of the other key factors, other than price, in increasing demand for such vehicles is obviously the point at which you can plug them in. And while you were answering one of my earlier questions, we had some picture for people who are listening to the conversation on radio rather than television of the black stump that you can stick the old cable into, be it at a filling station on the motorway or be it at home. In your view as a motoring journalist, is that the responsibility of the Department of Transport, Her Majesty's government, or is it the responsibility of the oil companies and the power companies? Who should be stumping up for that?
Yeah, I think it needs to be a joint venture, but I think what's been lacking to date is leadership from the government. They really need to provide a clear blueprint for what they expect to ensure that the whole country gets equal access to electric charging and the different speeds of electric charging, crucially. There are some much faster chargers that cost a huge amount of money to install. And of course, that needs some kind of incentivization because the oil companies aren't going to make the kind of investment they have to make into those systems back very quickly at the current time. So it needs a little bit of stimulation, it needs a lot of guidance, and it needs to improve super quickly. I think a private partnership with the government is ultimately what's required to make it happen and to fund it. But without strong leadership, I think we have a bit of a plan without a clear guide on how to get there, and that's really where the government's got to step in.
Message received loud and clear. Ask you the other side of the coin about the Netherlands. Are we being left behind by other countries? Can you say, look, you know, they're doing absolutely brilliantly on this in wherever it might be?
Yeah, I think the country to look to is Denmark. They've used their oil money very effectively to fund the transition to electric cars. Huge incentives to persuade people to switch, and they've achieved amazing things. They were around the share of electric vehicles that we're at now 3 or 4 years ago, and now around 75 to 80% of vehicles that are sold there are electrified. Of course, they have huge access to natural resources and natural power resources that, of course, help that transition. But you know, the UK isn't being left behind so much as being on the fringes of what is an exciting revolution, and I think we just need to keep pouring our expertise into making this transition. We know we have to commit to it. We've made a lot of ambitious statements, but now we have to put the funding behind that ambition to really make it happen. And I think another side of it is the manufacturing industry. The UK has a very, very proud automotive manufacturing industry, but if it doesn't invest in battery plants, it doesn't invest in the technology, that's where it most risks getting left behind.
Yeah. And as you rightly said earlier on, I agree with you 100%, very much a public-private joint venture, not just chucking the burden of responsibility exclusively to the taxpayer. The big oil companies and power generators can chip in as well and make life better for everyone. Jim, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this Sunday afternoon. That's Jim Holder, who's the editorial director of What Car magazine, talking about electric cars. Now, an ex-American Special Forces officer is calling on British people to donate vehicles. Nice segue there, to help rescue orphans from Ukrainian cities. Our reporter Ellie Costello has more on that story for you.
This estimate from their Minister of Social Affairs is that there's 10,000 Ukrainian orphans that are unaccounted for. And I have a very strong fear that, especially in the initial phases of what was going on here with all the confusion and all of these groups that are coming in with great hearts to try to move children out of harm's way, we may have jumped the gun a little bit and started pushing them across borders too quickly. And just to me, there's a likelihood and at least the conditions set for traffickers to come in and take advantage of the situation. And that's what I'm very concerned about. And that's why we are trying our best to, while still get them out of dangerous areas, to move them to safer areas before we responsibly put them over a border.
How do you know who is vulnerable, who is an orphan, who needs your help, and then how would you then get them to safety in places like Lviv? How does it work?
We'll receive a request from whether it's somebody who's in contact with the orphanages or what they're telling us are orphans, or it'll be the caregivers that are on the ground themselves. And then we talk to the Ministry of Social Affairs, and there's actually a national registry for orphans inside of Ukraine. And they will bounce that off of there and cross-reference it with their registry. And they'll say, yep, these are ones that we are tracking. And once we have that permission, we will activate our network. We'll physically go out there and get them, or we'll use proxies or people we're in contact with to go start moving them. And so once we get them from those dangerous areas in the east and we bring them over to areas such as Lviv or surrounding places, then we are safeguarding them. So we're taking them to designated shelters from the government that have their own child services that are there to help receive them, to ensure when they have something, you know, a nice meal to eat, some bedding, additional clothing, and we take care of them there, and we temporarily hold them for as long as needed, but we are as long as necessary. But after the holding process goes and they are cleared to potentially move across the border, then they'll move across the border. But if they want to stay there longer, then we try to increase that capacity for them to be in Lviv and surrounding areas longer if necessary. My appeal to British people watching this is donations are wonderful. If you have the ability to find resource, donate vehicles, that is really huge right now. We're running out of seats to move these children to safety. So that's very difficult for us to find right now.
Jeremy, how are the children, how are the kids faring with this? I mean, they must be absolutely traumatized, the children that you're coming into contact with.
When we do see them and they get to us, they are just kind of shocked. They're usually just quiet. And then when we start showing them kindness and giving them blankets or food or just anything, you do see them kind of relax a little bit. And when they do that, that's when their emotions start flowing and they're very tired. But I want people to understand is that when we find them, some of them been in shelters, when you say shelters, they've been inside of like cellars and basements, hiding from explosions for a week, very limited on food and not knowing what's going on. And then so they get to us and they're very exhausted and just, it's a really sad situation. I can't really describe it other than it needs to not happen.
There may or may not be fatigue, but there are, goodness me, some good people out there. The chairman yesterday and also Steve today from the Equestrian world, and that was Jeremy Locke finishing strong report from Ellie Costello. And if you want to donate a vehicle to the cause, you can head to the website. It is aerialrecoverygroup.com. Now, as promised, some more of your thoughts on what we've been speaking about today, the possibility of fatigue growing about the Ukraine conflict, and also whether net zero is still a priority. JT gets us underway. I'm frustrated at the time it takes to get the Ukrainian refugees to the United Kingdom. Cost of living very much on my mind. I'm ripping my Arga out. The UK net zero plan should be deferred, if not cancelled. Thanks, JT. Eve joins the conversation. I'd like to know how the average supermarket spend compares now versus a year ago. I bet the increase is way over 5.5%. I think, if I remember rightly, that one from Eve was stimulated partly with the conversation I had with Lord Rose, Stuart Rose, yesterday. But either way, thank you very much, Eve. Paul chips in. I'm amazed at how Ukraine has fought back and done so well against the Russians. If we have to turn off the heating so that Ukrainians can live free, then so be it. Thank you, Paul, for that. David says, whilst appreciating the massive hardships and deliberations of the less well-off here, it isn't near the deadly impact of war in Ukraine. As for declining support for net zero, this just shows how easy it is to manipulate and distract the gullible. Lexi says, I'm also frustrated at the deluge of illegal immigration. Weddings are cancelled, social events are cancelled, festivals are cancelled in order to house these illegals. What's going on? Because something clearly is, and we are being kept out of the loop. Mike sent us an email. Seeing the photos of mutilated, murdered, charred bodies of Ukrainian citizens, their fate dealt out by the thugs of Russia, repulses me. How the world is allowing it in 2022 is unforgivable. Ben, I think via Twitter, this is in people's minds, is what affects them on a day-to-day basis, their living standards, the day-to-day existence in their lives, bills and the cost of living. MPs are out of touch with the working people. People are fed up being trodden upon and fleeced by greed. Danny says it depends on the urgency. Some, like me, are used to getting by on the basics, others not so much. When you're faced with real poverty, it's hard to be concerned about external events. I think that's a really powerful point, Danny. Not being uncaring or unthoughtful, but it's about focusing on how you and your family get from A to B. You can still care, but it doesn't have the same impact. Time for just two more. David joins in and says, America and the United Kingdom have the responsibility to safeguard Ukraine's territorial integrity, something that cropped up very much in my last conversation with Elizabeth, Mark and General Sir Richard. They, not NATO, should engage militarily to fully support Ukraine's fight to evict Russian military from all of their territory. Call Putin's bluff over nuclear war. I'm not sure I'd go along with that one, David. You heard the warnings from a former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff. It is a real threat, and you call bluff at your cost. It's a dry run for the coming crisis with China, and that was something that Elizabeth Braw said in our earlier conversation. So there we are. Thank you very much indeed for all of those emails and the others that I didn't have time for on this programme. We're just coming up to 5 to 2, and this afternoon from 4 o'clock here on GB News. Sorry, I'm in the wrong place. Neil says, oh, we don't. You're telling me I've got time for some more? Oh, right. I just didn't have them printed out. My apologies. I'm going to do them straight from the camera, so fingers crossed I don't get them wrong. This one comes from Neil, who says, I think for what it's worth everything, Neil. We want to hear from our viewers. It really does matter. Neil says the war in Ukraine is drawing to an end, albeit slowly. There is probably a realization in the Russian military that the initial objective of occupying the whole of the country is unattainable. Therefore, the Russians will switch to damage limitation mode in terms of objectives, having to settle for a partitioned Ukraine. I wonder how the Ukrainians themselves feel about that. This is the East and the South particularly. They will have to settle for the Crimea and the Sea of Azov. Ideally, they would like Odessa too, but that is not going to be achievable, so they might destroy it instead. What a terrible prospect. That, I fear, is all that we have time for this Sunday afternoon. I shall be back again next Saturday and Sunday between 12 and 2. I hope very much indeed you can join me. Until then, a very good afternoon to you, and bye-bye.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking fine for many, though a few showers with rain and hill snow in the north. Let's take a look at those details. The weather across southwest England will be similar to yesterday, with some cloud around, but also lengthy spells of sunshine in which it will feel reasonably warm. A few showers are possible. It's looking very similar around the southeast. Temperatures may be a little disappointing for the time of year, and there'll be some cloud. Any showers across Wales should ease this afternoon, meaning it will be mostly dry. In between the patches of cloud, we may have some decent spring sunshine. Further showers are likely in the northwest of England this afternoon. They aren't expected to be particularly heavy, and many will avoid them. Temperatures will be a little down on average for April. After a mostly sunny morning, it's likely to turn cloudier across parts of northeastern England as we head through the afternoon. It should stay dry for most, though, with only an isolated shower. Rain and hill snow will push southwards across Scotland this afternoon, perhaps turning heavy at times in the far north. Southern parts will stay drier and brighter for longest. Meanwhile, the sunshine across Northern Ireland is set to turn hazy this afternoon before some thicker cloud pushes in from the northwest. It should remain dry here, though. While southern parts will stay mostly fine to the end of the day, rain will sweep across the northern half of the UK, and that's how the weather's shaping up for the rest of the day.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your